everyone, and welcome to the Harvest Lumber Company Woodworking Instructional Video Series. Today we're going to walk you through sanding a piece of wood and getting it ready for finish. Today we're going to be starting with an already flattened piece of wood. No matter what kind of wood you have to sand it in order for it to be ready to receive finish. There are a couple different ways that you can sand wood. You can be using a sanding block like this with the sandpaper that comes separately. We sell both of those. You can use an orbital sander that's electric and it can be corded or uncorded, and we also sell the sanding pads that attach to it. Now in some cases you've got a piece of wood that has a live edge. It looks like this. If you have a live edge piece of wood, there's also a wire brush that can be used to clean it up as well. Before we go in depth and begin to prepare this piece of wood to receive finish, it's important to note that there's a process for each piece of wood of bringing it from a coarse surface texture to a fine surface texture so that the finish will adhere and look beautiful. When you buy a piece of wood, it's important to sand it so that you can put finish on it later at the end of the project. The piece of wood that we have here has been flattened, but the texture of it is still rough. It's too soon to put finish on it. So what we're going to do is take our 80 grit sandpaper, which can be either the sanding block or the orbital sander, and we're going to start to sand the surface. When we sand the surface, it's important to go with the grain of the wood. This is aesthetic, so that when you put the finish on it, you don't see any vertical streaks that go perpendicular to the grain. So in this piece of wood, the grain is going this direction. We want to sand this direction. With the sanding block, you're going to use a lot of elbow grease. It's all powered by hand, but with the orbital sander, it's a lot easier because the electric motor is doing all the work for you. You turn it on and then you slowly go with the grain and then you circle back around and you circle back around. And it's good to go 2 passes. With grits, it's important to note that the coarser the grit is, the lower the number it is. So today we're starting with an 80 grit, which is coarse, and we're going to finish at a 220 grit, which is fine. Now once you've sanded the face of the wood, it's time to sand the end grain, which is this end, and then the edge grain, which is this side. In the case of this piece, we have a live edge, which we'll talk about in a second. But before we do that, it's just important to note that when you're sanding the end grain, you go in the long direction. The same is true with the edge grain. You go in the long direction. Some of you are going to have what we call a live edge on your wood, and that's just what we use to refer to what happens when the natural edge of the tree hasn't been removed from the wood. In the case of this piece, the bark has already been removed from the live edge, and what we're going to do to clean it is take this wire brush and gently scrape it along the grain of the wood. At that point, we can sand it by hand to clean it up a little bit further and get it ready for finish, moving progressively up through the grits to 220. At this point, we have our board pretty smooth. We have it at 220 grit, and it's ready to go on to what we call easing the edges. But just to recap, for people who haven't sanded before, it's important to go from coarse, which is a lower number, to fine, which is a higher number. Now in this case, again, we started at 80 grit, and we moved with the grain, and then we went to 120 grit, and we moved with the grain, and then we went to 220 grit, moving with the grain. We sanded the face, we sanded the live edge, we sanded the end grain, and we sanded the edge grain on the other side. And now we're ready to go ahead and ease all the edges on our piece of wood. The reason that we ease edges is to make them safe to the touch by taking away splinters, and also by making them a little bit nicer to handle. We break the edge and we just generally soften it. To do that, we're going to use a sanding block with 220 grit. Now since we've just spent a good amount of time sanding the face of our wood to 220 and making it nice, we really want to be careful not to mar the face of the wood as we ease the edge. So one technique that I like is by turning the edge out and at an angle with the sanding block, gently going across, and then also with the sanding block, moving with the direction of the grain on the face and then going down. So across at an angle, we want to be careful not to get too close to the face, so I like to rock it away, and then across and down. That's how you break the edge on a piece of wood that's already been sanded. And you want to go ahead and sand all the edges of the wood. So again, to recap, we've taken our flattened piece of wood and we've sanded through all the grits to 220, and then we ease the edges. We used our sandpaper and either a sanding block or an orbital sander. At Harvest, we sell sandpaper and sanding blocks so that you can do this at home.